What would you do if your faith was tested? Not in a church pew, but in front of hundreds of eyes waiting for you to fail. If your quiet devotion to the Virgin Mary became the target of a man who believed miracles were myths and faith was weakness. This happened one cold morning at Boston University, where a humble student stood before a proud professor and heaven listened. What began as a test of logic would end as a confrontation between pride and the Mother of God. No one there could imagine what would follow. Before we continue, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Let's see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary have reached. The lecture hall was enormous. Walls of pale brick, old wooden benches worn smooth by generations of restless students. The clock above the chalkboard ticked with the slow patience of eternity. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, but Professor Richard Hale was already in full stride, his voice sharp and steady, slicing through the drowsy silence. He was a man who inspired both admiration and fear. His intellect was unmatched, his reputation legendary. Yet there was something in his tone, a subtle contempt, that made even the boldest students shrink a little when he spoke. That day, his topic was the fallacy of faith in scientific reasoning. A curious subject for a chemistry course, but Hale was known for his digressions and for using his lectures as platforms for his beliefs, or rather, his disbelief. At the back of the room sat Elena Morris, a sophomore studying biochemistry. She was quiet, the kind of student teachers barely noticed, diligent, respectful, invisible. But beneath her sweater sleeve, her fingers often brushed a small silver rosary. It had been her grandmother's, a simple chain, worn smooth by years of prayer. Elena never flaunted her faith. She carried it silently, like a heartbeat. That morning, however, silence would not protect her. Science, Professor Hale declared, pacing before the board, has replaced superstition. The age of miracles is over. We live in an age of reason now. He turned sharply, his eyes sweeping across the lecture hall. Does anyone here still believe in fairy tales? A nervous laugh rippled through the room. A few students exchanged glances. Hale's gaze lingered, searching for an easy target. Then his eyes stopped. On Elena. "You there," he said, his voice coldly polite. "You've been quiet all semester. Tell me, do you believe in miracles?" Elena froze. Every head turned toward her. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with expectation. She could have lied. She could have shrugged and said, "No, sir." It would have been easier. But instead, she took a breath. "Yes," she said softly, "I do." A murmur swept through the room. Hale's eyebrow lifted. "You do," he repeated, almost amused. "And tell me, Miss Morris, have you seen one?" Elena hesitated. The words came slowly, like stepping stones over deep water. "Not with my eyes," she said, "but with my heart." The room erupted in laughter. Hale smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Ah, the heart," he said, "the last refuge of the unscientific mind." He turned to the class, chalk in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, here we have faith, the belief in what cannot be proven, and yet science demands evidence." He wrote the word evidence across the board, in bold white strokes. Then, turning back, he said, "Miss Morris, perhaps you'd like to prove your Virgin Mary exists." Elena's throat tightened. "I don't think faith needs proof," she replied. "If it could be proven, it wouldn't be faith." A pause. Even some of the students fell silent at that. Hale's eyes narrowed, the challenge igniting a spark of irritation beneath his composed exterior. "Convenient," he said. "When logic fails, belief fills the void." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand and returned to his notes. The class continued, but something had shifted. The air felt different, as though unseen eyes were watching. Elena lowered her head, silently reciting the Hail Mary beneath her breath. The words steadied her heart. When the lecture ended, students flooded out, whispering, laughing, some glancing at her with pity, others with mockery. Elena gathered her things slowly. She felt humiliated, but not broken. She touched her rosary once more, a small act of defiance, a quiet offering to the one she loved most. What Elena didn't know was that her answer, her simple, "Yes, I believe," had already set something into motion. That night, Professor Hale sat alone in his office, the glow of his desk lamp illuminating papers and chemical diagrams. The wind outside howled, rattling the window panes. He poured himself coffee, muttering about the foolishness of faith, the stubbornness of the human heart. And then, the lights flickered. He frowned, tapping the desk lamp. Nothing. The air grew strangely still. The ticking of the wall clock stopped. It was as if the room itself had paused to listen. In that silence, a faint, sweet scent filled the air. Soft, sweet, unmistakable. Roses. Hale blinked, confused. He looked around. There were no flowers, no air fresheners, nothing that could explain it. He stood walking towards the door, but his hand froze on the handle. Because there, reflected faintly in the dark glass of his office window, was a figure. A woman, veiled in light, her eyes gentle, sorrowful, filled with something he could not name. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks. He rubbed his eyes, turned back, but the scent of roses grew stronger, almost overwhelming. And then, as suddenly as it came, it vanished. The lights flickered back to life. The clock resumed its ticking. Everything was normal again. But Hale stood motionless, his heart racing. He didn't tell anyone. Not that night, not the next day. But from that moment on, something inside him began to change. Quietly, slowly, like dawn breaking through fog. Meanwhile, Elena prayed for him without knowing why. She simply felt it, a pull, a whisper within her prayers urging her to ask the Virgin to protect her professor. And heaven, it seemed, was listening once more.
The next morning, the campus seemed ordinary again. Students hurried through the cold, their breath forming pale clouds in the winter air. The chemistry building stood silent, its stone walls hiding the events that had quietly begun to unfold. But for Professor Hale, nothing felt ordinary anymore. He had not slept well. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that faint outline again, that woman made of light, looking at him not with judgment, but with sorrow. He told himself it was fatigue, that perhaps he'd inhaled too many chemical fumes the day before. Still, the scent of roses lingered faintly in his memory, something his mind could not quite explain away. By the time its first class began, Hale's sharpness had returned, though his composure carried a trace of unease. He spoke quickly, with a forced authority, as if trying to drown his thoughts beneath the sound of his own logic. His students noticed, especially Elena. She sat quietly in her seat, watching him with careful eyes. The professor who had once spoken of reason with unwavering confidence now hesitated at his own chalkboard, his sentences fractured by moments of distraction. Twice, he stopped mid-sentence, staring out the window as though expecting to see someone there. That night, the campus janitor would later report something strange. Around midnight, as he made his rounds through the chemistry wing, he heard a woman's voice, soft, almost like a lullaby, echoing faintly from Hale's office. When he opened the door, the room was empty. Only the faint scent of flowers remained. The next day, Hale arrived to find his lab assistants whispering. One of them pointed to a beaker on his desk. Inside, clear water shimmered with an iridescent hue, reflecting colors like stained glass. "We left distilled water here overnight, sir," one of them said, "but it looks different." Hale examined it closely. The composition was pure, too pure, beyond what standard distillation could achieve. It was impossible. He frowned and poured a small sample onto a glass slide. Under the microscope, the crystalline structures formed delicate symmetrical patterns, shaped somehow like petals. He said nothing. But that night, when he returned home, he dreamed of her again. The same woman, her eyes serene, standing on the shore of a great ocean. He woke with his heart racing, his pillow damp with sweat, the name Mary lingering on his lips like a forgotten prayer. The days passed, and whispers began to spread. Students claimed the chemistry wing smelled like roses. Some said they'd seen flickers of light near the professor's window at night. Others joked that maybe the Virgin herself had decided to audit one of his lectures. But for Elena, this was no joke. Each night, she knelt by her dorm window and prayed for her professor, for her classmates, for understanding. And one evening, while praying her rosary, she felt a sudden warmth, not like heat, but like sunlight touching her soul. A voice, soft and maternal, spoke within her heart. "Do not be afraid. He is seeing what he cannot deny." Elena wept. She didn't fully understand what it meant, but she knew the Virgin was near. That same week, Hale found himself drawn to the campus chapel, a place he had not entered in decades. The doors creaked open, and the scent of old candles met him. He walked down the aisle slowly, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. There were no students here, no laughter, no applause, only silence. And that silence felt alive. He sat in the back pew, unsure why he'd come. Before him, the statue of the Virgin Mary stood illuminated by faint candlelight. Her face was peaceful, yet her gaze seemed to pierce straight into him. He found himself whispering words he had long forgotten. "If you're real, if what I saw was real, show me." A flicker of light shimmered across the statue's face. He blinked. The candles had not moved. Yet for a moment, just one brief heartbeat, her lips seemed to tremble, as though she were about to speak. Hale stumbled out of the chapel, trembling. His reason told him it was imagination. His soul whispered otherwise. The next morning, he arrived to class pale and distant. As he lectured on molecular structures, a loud crack echoed through the lab. One of the glass flasks had shattered on its own. The students gasped. Hale froze. No one had touched it. And from that broken flask, the scent of roses filled the air. The room fell silent. Elena's eyes met his. She said nothing, but in her gaze she found neither triumph nor mockery, only quiet compassion. Hale dismissed the class early. Alone in the empty lab, he stood staring at the fragments of glass glittering on the floor. The scent of roses lingered for hours. He tried to write an explanation, but none made sense. The instruments were intact, the environment stable, and yet something had happened. He sat at his desk, staring at his hands. For the first time in years, he realized they were trembling. Slowly, almost unwillingly, he whispered, "What do you want from me?" The lights flickered once more. He looked up, and there, standing where the flask had broken, was the faintest outline of that same woman, radiant, silent, compassionate. Her voice, though not heard with the ears, echoed through the chambers of his mind. "Not what I want, what he wants, that you remember." Then she was gone, and for the first time in his life, Professor Richard Hale, the man who prided himself on logic, on proof, on reason, fell to his knees in the middle of his laboratory and wept. In the days that followed, the university seemed caught between disbelief and rumor. Students whispered about what had happened in the chemistry lab, the shattering glass, the scent of roses that clung to the air long after class had ended, the strange light glimpsed from the hallway. Some dismissed it as hysteria, others claimed it was a prank, but a quiet tension began to settle over the department, like fog that refused to lift. Professor Hale, once the embodiment of confidence and precision, was a shadow of himself. His lectures grew fragmented, his tone hesitant. He spoke of matter and molecules as if they were part of a dream slipping through his grasp. At times, he seemed lost in thought, his eyes unfocused, as though listening to something no one else could hear. He told no one about the apparition. Not the voice that had spoken in his mind, not the warmth that filled the room when he prayed alone at night, against his own disbelief. How could he? To the scientific community, he had built his life upon reason. Admitting to something divine, something unprovable, would mean destroying everything he had built. But miracles do not ask for permission. They simply happen. 3 days after the incident, Hale entered his office early in the morning and found an envelope on his desk. There was no name on it.
only a single sentence written in a woman's delicate handwriting. "You saw her, didn't you?" He froze. His eyes darted to the door, but the hallway was empty, only the hum of fluorescent lights. He opened the envelope. Inside was a simple holy card, an image of the Virgin Mary, surrounded by lilies. Beneath it, a small note: "Do not run from grace." He recognized the handwriting now. It was Yelena's. Later that day, he called her into his office. She entered nervously, clutching her rosary. The tension between them was palpable, not of hostility, but of something fragile, sacred. "Yelena," he began, slowly, his voice rough, "why did you leave this?"
Observe closely as the
She
flame
hesitated.
interacts with the chemical.
"Because I think you saw what I've always believed. I think she showed you mercy." Her words struck him like a whisper of truth he had long refused to hear. He leaned forward. "You speak of mercy, and yet mercy implies guilt. What guilt could a man of science have?" Yelena met his gaze. The guilt of closing his eyes when heaven opens them. The silence that followed was heavy. Outside, snow began to fall softly, blanketing the university in white, as if the world itself had paused to listen. That evening, Hale lingered in his lab long after everyone had gone home. He studied his notes, searching for an explanation. Every law of chemistry, every formula, every equation he had taught, none of them accounted for what he had seen. Finally, in frustration, he slammed his notebook shut and muttered, "If you're real, then prove it again." And at that moment, the lights went out. Total darkness filled the room. Then, faintly, a glow began to form in the corner near the shattered glass from days before. It shimmered like moonlight on water. Slowly, it took shape, not fully human, but unmistakably maternal. A veil, a face, eyes of infinite sorrow and love. He could not breathe. The air itself felt alive, and then came the voice. The same soft, patient voice as before. "Faith is not found through proof, but through surrender." The light faded, the darkness returned. Hale fell into his chair, shaking. He stayed there until dawn, his hands folded tightly, as if clinging to a truth too vast for words. The next morning, when his colleagues saw him, something had changed. His eyes were clear, his demeanor calm. But instead of beginning his lecture as usual, he paused, looked at his students, and said quietly, "There are things in this world that cannot be measured by equations. Sometimes what is unseen is what holds us together." Some students smirked, others exchanged puzzled glances. But Yelena, sitting in the front row, smiled faintly. She knew. That night, the janitor again reported the same phenomenon, the faint scent of roses in the hall and a soft light glowing from under the chemistry lab door. But this time, when he entered, the room was empty, except for a single rosary, laid neatly atop the professor's desk. The next morning, Hale's office was locked, his belongings untouched. He never came to class again. It was as if he had vanished. Weeks passed. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived at the university addressed to Yelena. It was written in Hale's handwriting. She opened it slowly, her hands trembling. "Yelena, I have gone where reason ends and truth begins. The Virgin has shown me that faith and knowledge are not enemies. They are two wings of the same soul. Tell them I am not lost. I am finally found." She pressed the letter to her heart, tears blurring the ink. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but for her, it felt like spring, the quiet kind that arrives not with thunder, but with grace. And from that day on, whenever students walked past the chemistry building, they swore they could smell roses,
because miracles do not end when the witnesses leave. They linger, like the echo of a prayer that heaven never stops answering.
Months passed since the morning Professor Hale disappeared. Boston University carried on, lectures resumed, and the corridors that once buzzed with whispers of miracles slowly returned to the dull hum of academia. But there was one place where silence seemed different: the chemistry lab. Students claimed that the lights flickered without reason, that sometimes, in the quiet between classes, they could smell roses again. To the janitors, it was superstition. To the faculty, coincidence. But to Elena, it was a reminder, a presence she could not explain, yet could not deny. Every week she went to the small chapel near campus, lighting a candle for the man who once mocked her faith. At first, her prayers were simple, for his safety, for understanding. But over time, they deepened into something purer: gratitude. Gratitude that she had witnessed what most never would. Gratitude that heaven had chosen such an ordinary place, a chemistry lab, to show that the divine walks quietly among equations and glass beakers. Then one afternoon, months after Hale's disappearance, a letter arrived at the university's administrative office. It bore no return address, only the faint imprint of a cross pressed into red wax. Inside was a short note written in elegant, deliberate script. To the faculty of Boston University, I once believed the universe could be contained within the logic of matter, but matter itself was born from love. I have found peace in serving that love, where knowledge meets eternity. Do not look for me. Instead, look within the silence between your thoughts. A.L. The initials, A.L., were unmistakable. Adrian Lee. The university officials dismissed it as a hoax, but the handwriting, it was perfect. It matched the professor's exactly. The dean ordered it filed away, never to be spoken of again. Yet rumors rippled through campus like wind through autumn leaves. Some said he had joined a monastery in Spain. Others whispered that he had been seen at Lourdes, kneeling before the statue of the Virgin Mary, weeping like a child. And then came the photograph. It surfaced in a small Catholic newspaper 6 months later, a picture taken by a pilgrim at a Marian shrine in Fatima. In the background, blurred by sunlight, was the unmistakable profile of a man wearing glasses, his hand clutching a rosary. A.L., or someone who looked exactly like him. The caption read simply, "A professor who once doubted, now prays." Elena saw the photo by chance. Her heart stopped. She clipped it from the newspaper, placed it in her prayer journal, and smiled through tears. It didn't matter if others believed. She knew. She knew the Virgin had taken him, not to punish, but to heal. Years went by. Elena graduated with honors, majoring in biochemistry, the very subject through which she had once been humiliated. Yet her thesis was unlike any other. It explored the harmony between faith and science, quoting saints alongside scientists, weaving the words of St. Albert the Great with theories of molecular order. Her final line read, "Faith does not contradict science, it completes it." The paper gained quiet recognition. Her mentor, an older professor of physics, once told her, "You remind me of him, of Hale, only lighter." She smiled, but said nothing. After graduation, Elena began teaching at a Catholic high school, where every lesson she gave began with one phrase: "Before you study the laws of nature, remember the one who wrote them." Sometimes, in her quiet moments, she would still hear that gentle voice echo in memory. Faith is not found through proof, but through surrender. And she knew that wherever Adrian Lee was, monastery or heaven, he too had found that surrender.
One winter evening, years later, she returned to the old Boston University campus. The chemistry building had been renovated, sleek and modern now, with new equipment and new faces. Yet as she passed through the hallway, a faint fragrance of roses stopped her, the same scent. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, there was a reflection in the lab window, not her own, but of a man standing behind her, faint, peaceful, smiling. He was wearing the same greatcoat she remembered, his eyes calm. She turned around, but no one was there. And yet the scent of roses lingered still. Elena pressed her palm against the glass and whispered softly, "Thank you, Professor, for believing." The next morning, the janitor found something strange inside the lab. A single white lily placed on the center table, dewy and fresh, though no one had entered the room that night. Rumors spread again, but this time they carried warmth instead of fear. Students began leaving small flowers on that table before exams, whispering short prayers for clarity and peace. What had begun as a tale of mockery had turned into a quiet tradition, the prayer for wisdom, as they called it. Faith had taken root in the very heart of skepticism. And perhaps, somewhere in the silence, Adrian Lee smiled, the scientist who once demanded proof, now immortalized by a miracle that could never be measured.
There's a quiet stillness that comes after great storms. A peace that doesn't erase what happened, but rather reveals what it meant. Years after the incident at Boston University, the story of Professor Adrian Lee became more than a campus legend. It became a parable, one whispered between students late at night, retold by teachers who once laughed at the impossible. It became the story of the man who mocked faith and found heaven instead. Elena, now in her 30s, had grown into a woman of serene strength. Her eyes still carried that same unshakable gentleness she had on the day she stood against the professor's ridicule. Her classroom walls were filled with quotes from both saints and scientists, from St. Augustine to Einstein. She believed that truth wasn't owned by one world or the other. It was a bridge suspended between them, built from both reason and grace. Her students often asked her, "Miss Morris, do you really believe in miracles?" She would smile, pause for a moment, and answer softly, "I don't just believe, I've seen one." And when they asked her to tell the story, she always began the same way. Once there was a man who thought faith was a lie, but God loved him too much to let him die believing that. Then she'd tell them everything: the cold lecture hall, the challenge, the blinding light, the scent of roses. But what struck her students most wasn't the miracle itself. It was what came after, the transformation, the mercy that turned arrogance into awe, the love that reached beyond logic. Sometimes after class, she would sit by the chapel near the schoolyard. The candles flickered softly in the shadows. There, she would pray, not just for herself, but for every soul still searching for meaning between science and spirit. For every Adrian Lee who couldn't yet see that the Virgin Mary doesn't wait in churches. She walks where doubt lives. She goes where faith has been forgotten and reignites it in the most unexpected hearts. Elena grew older, her hair silvering softly. Yet every year on the anniversary of that morning, the day when logic met the divine, she lit 2 candles in the chapel, one for herself and one for him. And on one particular anniversary, when she whispered her final prayer, a small group of her students followed her into the chapel. They didn't know the full story, but they understood enough to kneel beside her. Together, they recited the Hail Mary, each word rising like incense, carrying a legacy that had begun in doubt and ended in faith. The candles burned brighter than usual that night, as if someone unseen stood among them. And perhaps, just perhaps, someone did. Faith is the light that shines where reason ends. If you've ever doubted, if you've ever been mocked for your belief, Remember, the Virgin Mary hears even the quietest hearts. Her miracles do not need proof. They need witnesses. So wherever you are watching from right now, take a deep breath, whisper a prayer for those who no longer believe, and let your faith be the answer to their disbelief. Because sometimes the greatest miracles are not the ones we see, but the ones we become. Pray, believe, and share this story so that faith, once tested, may shine again. Follow Light of Mary to keep her light alive.